All right, so now that we're able to save survey submissions, let's look at how we're going to handle responses. So to do that, let's open up our code editor and let's navigate to the Actions section. So here we have a function, it's function 5.3, where we save our responses. Now, something to note here is right before we output our success result, we grab some HTML by calling the getQuestionHTML function again. Well, right now this function is going to return the same HTML every time, except for when the survey is completed. Then it's going to return a message that says survey complete. What we'd like instead is for it to return statistics on how many votes have been received for each different response option for that particular survey. So let's go update that function right now. It's under helpers, and it's the first function under helpers 6.1. And if we look here in our if statement, if the question is answered, what we're doing is we're just setting our inputs to be this message, thank you for completing our survey. So we're going to update that now. And so I'm just going to replace this function with the updated code, and then we'll review the changes. All right. So the first change that we see here is this line right here where we set our answered variable. Now there is something here called forced results. So if we look at the top of our function, we're now accepting a second argument called forced results or forced results, and the default is false. What this is going to allow us to do is to, when we call this function, we can say, hey, give us the statistics for the survey, whether or not I've completed the survey. So that'll allow us to force the survey results. Okay, so answered is going to be equal to either forced results. If forced results is true, then answered is going to be true. Otherwise, answered is going to be equal to the result of question is answered, which is going to be true or false. That's the actual result, whether or not we've answered this survey. All right, this is all the same here, completed class. Then what we've done is we've moved the inputs variable outside of our if statement here, because right now, each case for this if statement is going to return list items. So we're opening the list items here, and then we're closing them down here with our inputs variable. If not is answered the survey, that's the same as before. This is the new stuff right here. So if the survey's been completed, then what we're going to do is we're going to loop over each of the options. And each time we loop over them, we're going to run a new function called getResponseStats, which takes a survey ID and the response value. Then what we're going to do is set our input here to be the name of that option plus the stat percentage next to it. So let's look at this function over here, the getResponseStats function. So we're going to have to add that. But before we add that, let's update our question is answered function. That's in our helpers here. That's the next function right below this one, 6.2. Remember when we created this function initially, I said that we would come back to this later because we just defaulted it to false every time. So now we actually want to check to see if the question has been answered now that we have a new function for looking at the user's IP address and we can access the database that we created. So here's the updated function that does that. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to pull in WordPress's global WPD DB variable so that we can interact with its database. Return value is defaulting to false. That's the same as before. But inside here, we're going to do a PHP try statement, and then we're going to grab the user's IP address using our new function getClientIP. Then we're going to write some SQL. So we're going to select the response ID from the database. That's the option chosen, where the survey ID is going to be equal to what's being passed in here, survey ID, and the IP address is going to be equal to this IP address up here. So that's going to allow us to check our custom database table to see if there's a response from this user's IP address for this particular survey. So then we prepare this query now, and we pass in the SQL, and we pass in those two variables that it's going to turn into. Survey ID is going to make sure it's a decimal, and IP address is going to be a string. Now we run the query, and we're using getVar, which is going to return one record. It's actually going to return the response ID for this particular query. And so if it's successful, it's going to return that ID, and we're going to store it in entry ID. Otherwise, it's going to return null. So that's our next if statement here. We check to see if the entry ID is not equal to null, so it was successful. Then we're going to return the value of that entry ID as our result here. So we're setting our return value to that. And that's what we do at the bottom of our function. So we're going to return that now. So now if the question is not answered, it'll return false. And if it's answered, it'll be true because the entry ID will be a number greater than 0. All right, so let's create that function, the getResponseStats function, that new one. So we're going to add that to our helpers. We're going to add it down here right after our last one. All right, so here we go. Here's our new function, SSP getResponseStats. So it takes the survey ID and the response ID. So what we do is we set up our return variable is going to be an associative array, and it's going to have two values in it, percentage and votes. Percentage is going to default to 0%, and votes is going to default to 0. Then inside of a PHP try statement, we're going to get the item responses for this particular survey. Now this is a new function that we're going to have to write yet. Get item responses. It takes a survey ID and a response ID, and it returns the responses for this particular survey. Then we're going to get the total responses for this survey. So item responses returns the responses for the particular response. So if say strongly agree, it's going to only return the responses for that. And then survey responses is going to return the total number of responses for the entire survey. So then if the survey responses are greater than 0 and the item responses are greater than 0, then we set up our stats down here. So the percentage is going to be equal to, we're just going to do some math here, the ceiling value of item responses divided by survey responses times 100. That's going to give us a percentage. And then the votes, that's going to be just the total item responses for this particular response statistics. And then if an error is thrown, we'll just dump it in a debug here. Otherwise, we're going to return those newly created stats from our function. So that's the getResponseStats function. So this function calls those two new helper functions that we just mentioned. So getItemResponses and getSurveyResponses. So let's create those now. And we can just add that right below here. So here's our next function, getItemResponses. Again, it takes a survey ID and response ID. We're pulling in the global WP-DB variable so that we can interact with the WordPress database. We're setting our default response value, which is a variable called item responses, to 0. And then we're going to run our query. So here we're selecting the count. This is a SQL function to count the number of records. And we're storing that count as a total variable from, and then this is our database table with our responses in it, where the survey ID is equal to the survey ID being passed in, and the response ID is equal to the response ID being passed in. So we prepare that query next by passing in the SQL we just made, and then the variables that are coming in through our function. Now we run the query using the WP-DB getVar function, which is going to return a single record that's going to have a total count in it. So that record will be equal to the total. So we set that as our item responses variable. And then again, if there's an error in our code or something goes wrong, then our debug function will run here. Otherwise, we return the item responses. So this should give us a number. All right, so the next function is the getSurveyResponses. That's going to give us the amount of responses for the entire survey and not just the item being selected. So this is pretty much almost identical to the function that we just wrote. This function simply has a little bit different SQL. So here we get the total. where the survey ID is equal to the survey ID being passed in. We're not limiting it to a particular response ID. And then we prepare that query and run that query, and that gives us the total amount of responses for this survey, and we return that. All right, so now let's update our shortcode that displays our survey. So let's go up to shortcodes here, find our survey shortcode. All right, so I'm just going to update this shortcode, and I'll just review the changes. So in our shortcode now, we've got a piece of code here, this n_once, and this responses value up here. So we're using our new function getResponses to pull in the amount of submissions so far for the survey, and we display that value now in the paragraph tag right above our submit button. So now it says submit your responses to see the results of all, and then it shows the amount. So this would be like all 10 participants surveyed. Below that, we're setting up a new variable here called n_once, and we're calling a custom WordPress function, a WordPress function, built-in WordPress function called WP n_once field. We're passing in this custom value here, SSP save survey submission, and it includes the ID of the survey at the end. Then we're saying that we want the input to be called WP n_once. And so let's look more at this function here. So what is this n_once thing? So according to WordPress, an n_once is a number used once to help protect URLs and forms from certain types of misuse, malicious or otherwise. WordPress n_onces aren't numbers actually, but are a hash made up of numbers and letters. Nor are they used only once, but they have a limited lifetime after which they expire. During that time period, the same n_once will be generated for a given user in a given context. The n_once for that action will remain the same for that user until that n_once lifecycle has completed. So you can read more about n_onces on WordPress's Codex website on this page here. So in layman's terms, an n_once is basically a unique string that identifies this current user. So if somebody's trying to hack our website and submit a bunch of times to our custom function, they will have to have a valid n_once to do that. So this is just an extra security feature that WordPress recommends using when interacting with any data going in and out of the database. And since we're adding information to our database table, it's a good idea to use an n_once. So we create that using this function, which is going to output some unique form fields, and then we include that here in our form now. All right, those are the only changes to that shortcode so far. So now that we have that n_once, we need to verify it when this form submits to the Ajax handler. So let's update our function in our action section where we save the response. It's 5.3 Ajax save response. So what we want to update here is the portion of code where we're saving to the database here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap this portion of code in an if statement. So now I'm running an if statement that checks to see if the Ajax refer or the n_once is valid, and I do that by calling this function check Ajax refer, and that's a built-in WordPress function as well that basically just compares that input that's coming in from the form to make sure that it's valid. And so we want to make sure that this is exactly the same as what we used before. So if this is not true, then we're going to return a message that says n_once is invalid. Otherwise, we're going to be able to, we feel comfortable now saving to the database, so we're going to run our save command, and all of this other stuff here is the same as before. So that should work for handling our new n_once. So now's a good time to update our table of contents. So let's go up there And let's add in some new items. So we added a bunch of new helpers. All right, so make sure you save your file now. Now all we need to do is update our JavaScript just a little bit. So let's open up our public SSP.js file. And here where we, on our submit action event, we're going to update this code just a little bit. Okay, so I'll point out what's changed here. So we are now setting up a data structure here. Instead of including it how we did before, we just had it manually put in here. So here we're now providing these two new items in our data structure. These are the inputs that are once generated in our function, our PHP file. So we need to include these now when they're being submitted so that we can compare them. So these are the names of those fields. And then we're just using jQuery to grab the value of those. Survey ID and response ID remain the same as before. So here now in our Ajax, where we pass in the data, we're just passing in the data variable now that we just created. And then we've updated the success response just a little bit. So now we're checking to see if the response status attribute is equal to 1 or more, so true. If it is, we're going to replace the HTML in our DL, which is up here where we grab the closest DL. We're going to replace it with the new HTML that we get back from our SSP Ajax save response function. And then what we do is we're going to hide our survey footer as well. That's with the little button that says submit responses, because we don't want somebody to just submit a response twice. Otherwise, we're just going to display the response message, which is going to be some kind of error if it doesn't work. Great. So make those changes and be sure to save your JavaScript file now. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to WordPress now, navigate to Pages, and then click View on Surveys. All right, so here's our form. I've been doing some testing already, so I already have a few different responses in for this form. So you'll notice that this number here says that there are 6 participants. That's because I've added some different items to my database, but yours will probably say 0. Anyway, so let's try this form out. Before we do that, let's go to View, Developer, JavaScript Console. That's so we can use that for debugging. And let's select an item here and click Submit Your Response. So what you should see is it should automatically change. The radio buttons will disappear, and you'll get numbers next to each item here. If we look at our JavaScript console here, we can see the values going in and out. So we're getting our status back and then the updated HTML. Okay, so if I were to look at my database now, I'll just open up MAMP and open up phpMyAdmin. And here's this project's database, tables, and here's our database. I'm just going to click Browse. So here's all of the tests that I've done already. I just manually changed the IP address so that it wouldn't recognize me, because when I'm working locally, the IP address that shows up is this ::1. So if we were to go back to our page here and reload, we're going to continue to get the statistics back. But if I were to change this record here, where it's ::1, I change that to say 18 and update it. Now when I go back here, if I reload, I have the option to submit again, and that's because my current IP address doesn't exist in the database, so it's allowing me to participate in this survey. All right, great job. You've successfully created a survey that can now capture data and respond to that data and display the new results or statistics for our survey. So stay tuned. In the next lecture, we're going to update our survey administration page to display some custom admin columns. So look forward to that.